Someone's cringing in the back. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome to the Druid's Head. I hold meetings here twice a month. Normally we're not all hooked up with microphones and things, so this is a bit different today. I'm really, really excited and happy and thrilled to welcome Roger Castillo here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, incidentally.
It's a bit of an unusual one. I've not done this before, where we've had a joint satsang with someone else who also shares this. So I'm as intrigued as perhaps the rest of you are as to how this will pan out, and we will see. But from what I know of Roger, if you don't mind me saying, is an incredibly sincere and warm person, and I think as long as we maintain some kind of friendliness, we'll be okay. What do you reckon?
I expect nothing less.
So what are we here to talk about?
Well, actually that's great, because that's where I start off usually in these talks, is to make it very clear from the outset so that the seeking, the contemplating can remain very focused. That the talks that I put forward are essentially about happiness in daily living. Happiness for the human being in daily living. And
turn the volume up a little bit. I'm so sorry to interrupt. It's just maybe a bit hard of hearing or something.
yeah, you can maybe just on the back of the speaker there's a plus sign if you press it twice. Okay, well, maybe again. Testing.
Thanks. Thank you very kind.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
Can everyone else hear everyone okay? Or hear us okay?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great place to start. And in fact, even if the question wasn't asked, that's the starting point of the teaching, is to make it very clear what we're talking about. And it's about happiness in daily living. That's the practical, that's what practically we're speaking about. And so asking ourselves this question, if we find ourselves as seekers, it makes sense that we ask this question of ourselves and come up with a very clear answer for ourselves. So the question that is suggested that we all ask ourselves, what am I really looking for? I find myself seeking. We might realize that for some people we've been seeking for many years, and maybe we haven't even asked this question. What is it that I'm really looking for? And it's encouraged that we drop all concepts that we might have about what we're looking for and say, I'm going to ask this question sincerely and come up with an answer from my own experience, maybe using some help, some guidance, but not going to use the guidance as the answer to the question, but rather the guidance as a way of really answering the question for myself. If we don't do that, then we might find ourselves seeking for many, many years, and at the end of it, we might actually find that we haven't really gone anywhere. We find ourselves frustrated. And so the suggested answer to this question, which isn't an answer that's unique to everyone, it would sound like, if we ask ourselves, what am I really looking for, that one person will come up with one answer and another person another answer. It's suggested that the answer is the same for everyone, that when we drop all concepts about what we think we're looking for, we might start to see from ourselves, actually, all I'm looking for is happiness. I just want to be happy. And I'm seeking because I think it will deliver me happiness. When I was not seeking and I was looking for success or fame or money or relationship, when I look at it, it's because I thought that would deliver happiness. So if we come to this conclusion for ourselves, then we can start looking at this question of happiness. And once again, I suggest we look at it in very practical terms. So Tom has suggested, or I suggested, and we came to an agreement that maybe I'll talk for a little while and put forward the teaching as I put it forward. And there's a dovetailing between what I talk about and what Tom talks about. It's very complementary. In fact, when I first came across Tom, it was when I was invited to partake in a radio or the online program, and I thought I'd better have a look at what the interviewer is like. I hadn't seen the program before, and Tom had been interviewed that week. So the last interview was Tom's, and I sort of thought, okay, I'll listen to the last one. And he started talking in the interview, and I was a little taken back. This guy says what I say. And then he went on a bit further, and he elaborated on some nuances about beliefs, and this is what I say. And it's a bit unusual, because even though this is really a very common topic, spiritual seeking and spiritual teaching, they all approach it differently, and this non-doership and some other nuances are not really focused on in a lot of teachings. And so I thought, I know I haven't been watching things on the internet for a long time, but this is very strange. So anyway, so from the very beginning, there was very clearly a recognition that what we say is very similar. Now, the way we put it forward and some of the terminology, the words, might be different. And to me, that's not a problem, actually. And if a seeker finds themselves functioning in a certain way, a way that Nisargadatta would describe as earnest, that person is an earnest seeking, an earnest seeker, then one of the characteristics of that is to be interested in discerning certain things and figuring out how the same word maybe is being defined differently by different teachers and teachings, and really becoming clear on this for ourselves so that confusion isn't there. So after I've put forward the framework, then I'm sure we'll have a discussion, and the more questions there are, the more that it'll flesh things out. And so if someone says, but there's a difference here, we can talk about it. And there probably will be differences, because there's lots of different obstacles that need to be undone with a teaching. That's what a teaching essentially does. So I'll talk for a little bit and put the framework, the conceptual framework that I present out, and then we'll see where from there. So having asked this question, what am I really looking for? Is anything you wanted to add before I...
I think that's great, what you've just said. The only thing I want to add is apologies. I've got a cold, I've got a sore throat. You might have to put up with me spluttering and coughing. I'm going to be turning on and off this microphone so you don't hear me coughing. How's that? Good.
So, having asked this question of ourselves, wanting a very, practical answer, so that we don't get lost, so that we can keep coming back to this question and this answer when we feel we've got lost. What is the answer to the question? I'm looking for happiness, but if I'm looking for happiness and I've always been looking for happiness, why haven't I found it? What is this happiness? And so here are some concepts. Now, everything that is said in the teaching is a concept. A concept is not the truth, but it can be very useful at pointing and allowing attention to land on aspects of life that maybe haven't been seen before. And everything that is mentioned here in these teachings is mentioned because it's particularly relevant to this question and what humans are looking for. Happiness in daily living. So, happiness is not to be found in outcomes. That's what we've taken happiness to be. There's a deeply ingrained belief, when we look at it, that says my happiness is to be found in circumstance. My happiness is to be found in outcomes. Essentially, my happiness is to be found when life is pleasure, 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 pleasure. It's a deeply ingrained belief, and the good news is it's a false belief, it's an error. Why is it good news? Because the flow of life as it unfolds moment after moment, is always going to be, always has been, a mix of pleasure and pain. So sometimes pleasure, and then the pleasure may turn into a pain. And so if our happiness was to be found in pleasure, 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 we might as well pack up our bags, hang up our boots, go home, and say, actually, if my happiness was to be found in pleasure, 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 I can see from my own experience that life is always a mix of pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And so I can conclude happiness for the human being isn't available. We've been told for thousands of years in wisdom teachings, happiness for the human being is our birthright. Happiness on a continuous, unbroken basis is actually our true nature. So what is this happiness, which is not happiness through outcome, not happiness through circumstance? Well, it turns out that in practical terms, happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. Meaning a comfortableness with oneself, regardless of whether life is pleasure or pain. Now that's a concept. If we don't have this happiness, then we hear this and we say, well, am I going to believe this? I don't really know what happiness is. So the first suggestion here is happiness is not to be found in outcomes. It's not circumstantial. And so we can start looking, is this belief ingrained? Is my movement and are my reactions demonstrating to me when I investigate that I do have a belief that happiness is to be found in outcomes? When outcomes don't go the way I want it, is there a feeling inside, a reaction inside that is such that demonstrates I do have a belief inside that says what I am is somehow defined by or dependent on circumstance? And I'll suggest that on those times where we can put our hand on our heart and say, in this moment, even if I don't know what happiness is, in this moment I know I'm not happy. So if we look at those times when we can put our hand on our heart based on our own experience and say, in this moment I'm not happy, the suggestion is that that unhappiness, when it's investigated, is always a result of our attitude to the flow of life. It might at first glance seem like it's dependent on the flow of life, circumstances painful, not in line with our preferences. So we might make the mistake, oh, my unhappiness in this moment, I know I'm not happy, is because that person has delivered pain in my life. When we look at it more closely, we'll find that our unhappiness is actually an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other, based not on the circumstance, but based on our attitude to the circumstance. This is very important. We're starting to see what our unhappiness is, which we can verify for ourselves based on our own experience. And furthermore, we can elaborate what that unhappiness is, and the concepts put forward is that unhappiness will be found in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So remember all these concepts. I mean, it sounds very intellectual, and someone might say, well, actually the spirituality, it's not meant to be so intellectual. Maybe, but maybe not. Remember, what am I really looking for in life? A very important question. And if we investigate it, we might conclude, actually I am just looking for happiness. Everything I'm doing because I hope it's going to give me happiness. Now we're doing a direct investigation into what our unhappiness is that we can confirm. And on investigation, we'll find it's an arising in these different forms, an uncomfortableness, based on our attitude always, not circumstance, and arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, and attachment and expectation. So if we see that, now we need to know what is at the base of those feelings. And on investigation, we'll find that guilt, blame, and pride reside on the deeply ingrained belief that I am the doer and the other is the doer. Meaning a belief that says, well, obviously whatever happens through me, whatever I think, whatever I feel, whatever I do in each moment is my doing. I'm the agent. I'm a separate, independent entity in complete control of my thoughts and my actions. So I'm the doer. I'm the creator. And if we see ourselves like that, which makes complete sense because the experience of life, when we take it on the surface, tells us that. If we see ourselves as the doer, we see the other as the doer. We see them in experience as a separate, independent entity, and we know ourselves as the same, so we project onto the other that they're like me, a separate, independent entity in control of everything they think, feel, and do. So this deeply ingrained belief is there, I am the doer and the other is the doer. And guilt, blame, and pride, guilt is a reaction inside that happens when something in life, an unfolding in life, that happens through this body, delivers pain to the other, to someone we love, to myself, or maybe even to a stranger. And the attitude is, I am the doer, I should have and I could have done it differently. And so guilt is this uncomfortableness with the outcome, based on the assumption, I could have done it differently, I should have done it differently. So we feel not good enough. That's essentially what guilt is. In its very intense form, we could say it's shame. Blame, when we look at it, is an uncomfortable feeling that arises inside of us as a result of our attitude to the circumstance. The circumstance, when blame arises, is pain in the moment that is delivered through the actions of the other. They do something that's not in line with our preferences. So pain, and then we look at them as the doer, and we say, you should have done it differently. You could have done it differently. You hurt me, so I hate you. And that's the story at the bottom of the feeling of blame. And pride is a sense, when we look at it closely, of uncomfortable. Look what I have achieved. When life unfolds through actions that happen through ourself, and the outcome is positive. And seeing myself as the doer, well, I want everyone to know, look what I have achieved as a doer. And so on that basis, when things are not positive, when the outcomes are not positive, we blame the other or ourselves. So we can see that guilt, blame, and pride, all based on the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. And then accompanying this deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, there is a deeply ingrained belief, which we spoke about at the beginning, that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. So if we believe ourselves to be an entity that requires life to be pleasure, 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 we feel attacked on a level of self when life doesn't deliver pleasures. Life impacts this belief system that explodes into a feeling of uncomfortableness. And that's where worry and anxiety come into the picture, where we're afraid of what might happen in life, understanding that life is uncertain, and this belief exists in life, knowing it's uncertain, and worry, and in its intense form, anxiety. Anxiety is this feeling something has already gone terribly wrong, and I'm just waiting to hear about it. Expectation and attachment to outcome, based on the idea I need certain things, and so we have a strategy of how life could look, believing I'm the doer, so we have this idea, okay, this is what I need to do in order to bring about this outcome, and we can live our whole life continually strategizing about what life should look like, and I'm in control as the doer, so I'm going to make it happen. And attachment to outcome is particularly pointing in this set of concepts as the feeling that arises when our expectation isn't met, when something goes wrong. We miss our aeroplane, right? Not what we expect life to be. And the feeling is you're at the checkout counter and they say, oh, sorry, the gate closed 30 seconds ago. No! And, this, and then blame comes up, or guilt. The attachment to outcome is this reaction when life unfolds. And it's all of these different reactions are an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other, or life, ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself. Now the really great news is that these beliefs, when investigated, turn out not to be as accurate as we might think. They don't hold as much water upon investigation as we think, which essentially means they're an error, they're a mistake, they're an idea of who we are and what life is that's not that accurate. This is really good news because it's an error, which means the suffering is essentially an error arising from an error. If it was accurate that I am the doer and the other is the doer, and accurate that who I am is dependent on circumstance, who I am in my completeness is dependent on circumstance being pleasure, 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 then once again we could conclude, oh, this human happiness isn't available. My guilt, my blame, and my pride makes complete sense. I am the doer, so I am in control, and I should have and could have done it differently. So let's have a quick look at why, on investigation, this belief is not accurate. If people have had an awakening, then from that witnessing perspective that may arise from time to time, it becomes very clear that life is happening, that the body is an object arising in consciousness, and that whatever arises in consciousness is not determined by anything. It is what it is. It has arisen in consciousness, and the movement of life is a happening. So it becomes very clear from this witnessing consciousness that the body is an object, not the subject. The body is essentially moving as part of the experience. And from that witnessing perspective, there's peace present, and the peace is present regardless of what the experience is. Pain still arises, and there's a peace with the pain. So it starts to become very clear from that perspective that the belief in doership is a belief that made sense when the subject was believed to be the body, and it makes no sense when this awakening perspective is present. And similarly, the belief that my happiness, my completeness, is to be found in circumstance also makes no sense when the witnessing presence is there, because we find ourselves automatically, without making any effort, at peace, even when circumstance is painful. But if that awakening perspective isn't present, how else can we confirm that these beliefs are not accurate? Well, we can look at this from a causal investigation. Now, this is two different ways of seeing life. either as a spontaneous arising or as an experience that unfolds according to laws of cause and effect. An experience that, even when known to be a spontaneous arising, is undeniably still an experience that is based on apparent time and space, on apparent cause and effect. So what that means is, if life is a spontaneous arising, fair enough, but what arises is not an oak tree that suddenly appears in front of us for no rhyme or reason. If that was our experience, then we'd say it's a spontaneous arising. That's demonstrated by the fact that an oak tree that seems like it's 300 years old has just appeared in front of me. Right? The fact is that if we come to see life as a spontaneous arising, it doesn't change the fact that how the experience appears is it appears to follow laws of cause and effect. So an oak tree arises when there is an apparent trail of cause and effect. So let's investigate this doership according to causality. So the human being in each moment is one way, the way they are. And when we look at the way they are, we can see that it's a result of two factors: their genes and their up-to-date conditioning. And when we look at these two factors, we find I wasn't in control of my genes. I wasn't in control of the parents I was born to. So I was born with a genetic structure. And the other factor, up-to-date conditioning, is a result of how life impacts us. The flow of life, moment after moment after moment after moment. Life is continually delivering new conditioning, and the new conditioning accumulates, and is the cumulative at any point in time is what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. Now, life delivering new conditioning can add to the existing dynamic of our up-to-date conditioning, or it can radically change it. But however it impacts us, however the new conditioning impacts us, it leaves us in each moment with what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So if we can find a third factor that determines how the human being is in each moment on a biological and a psychological level, then this theory goes out the door. But if we can't find a third factor that determines how the human being is, design-wise, in a particular moment on a biological and psychological level, then we have to start saying, this actually makes some sense. The human being at any point in time is a result of two factors: their genes and their up-to-date conditioning. Two factors upon investigation we find are not in our control. And so the human being designed one way finds themselves in circumstance, also not in their control. They see something, they hear something, they taste something, they touch something, they smell something. And a reaction happens, or a response happens. I'm not differentiating between reaction and response in the body as a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. A happening, not anyone's doing. We can look at the example of two chemicals coming together. They have a chemical composition, their composition, that they weren't in control of. The chemical is what it is. The two chemicals come together, and there's a reaction, an inert reaction or a violent reaction, somewhere in between. And the reaction is a happening. The chemicals don't sit down and have a conference as to how they're going to react. It just happens. Now, the belief in personal doership doesn't see the human like this. The belief in personal doership says, hang on, I am the thinker. I am the chooser. I, as a separate independent entity, unaffected by anything else. Independent means unaffected by anything else. So there's this belief that there is a chooser, what I'm calling a doer, the doer belief, the agent. When it's investigated closer, we find actually the body is a biological instrument designed by life to be one way, finds itself in circumstance, which is one way. And there's a very impersonal reaction that feels very personal. I'll grant us that. But at some point we have to go, wow, I responded, I reacted in that moment the only way I could. The sense of personal doership would say, you should have acted differently. And that's not recognizing that should have it's a theoretical, it's a hypothetical. If the action was different, it would mean that the human being would have had to be essentially different in design, or the circumstance would have to essentially be different. And if anything was different, then the output would be different. The fact is, everything was as it was, and so the output was as it was. A simple investigation like this can start to dissolve a whole lifetime of ingrained belief. Now, if I'm not the doer, it means I didn't do the belief into place. If we look at it this way, we find, the belief was put into place as part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And a large part of what puts the belief in place is the experience that we have in each moment. The experience from a very young age is, on the surface, I have free will. And as a result of having that experience, meaning the sense of free will in the moment to do exactly what I feel like doing, the belief that I am the doer, the belief I have free will, gets put in place by life, based on the experience at hand. Life conditions us moment after moment after moment, and our belief system is a result of life conditioning us a certain way. Now, the doer principle inside, the doer principle hates to hear this. It'll come, the reaction based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, if the up-to-date conditioning includes this doer belief, the reaction at the moment will be of all sorts of uncomfortableness, all sorts of stories about, no, this is, why am I here? I'm not meant to be here. This is all a load of nonsense. Also, a thought arising in the moment, a happening, according to one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. So at this point, the concept is brought in. All of life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, is a happening, predetermined to unfold exactly the way it unfolds. So if that thought arises, it's part of the predetermined story of life that is not my doing, it's a happening. So remember, what am I really looking for? A question that we ask ourselves. The answer might be, I'm not sure. I can see that everything I do is because I want to be happy. I'm not sure what this happiness looks like. I know what my unhappiness is. My unhappiness is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And this is when I'll insert another concept. The concept says human happiness, whether we realize it or not, is continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And that continuous unbroken that continuous unbroken peace of mind, in practical terms, is simply the absence, the non-arising of suffering. The continuous unbroken peace of mind is our natural way of being when this false idea of who I am has dissolved and therefore no longer produces this uncomfortable feeling, which is a resistance to the way life is destined to unfold. And so that means that happiness is the end of suffering. And so if happiness is the end of suffering, it makes a lot of sense for us to understand what this suffering is and to investigate it. So nothing that is put forward here is being asked of you to be taken as a belief. Please don't. Once again, these are concepts that based on how the concepts land, which is not in my control or your control. This is life throwing out new conditioning. So Ramesh, my teacher, used to say, be very clear that what's happening now is just life throwing out new conditioning. And that new conditioning has the potential to radically change your up-to-date conditioning. This is not the sort of conditioning that life generally delivers. How it changes your up-to-date conditioning, not in your control and not in my control. Some people might be listening to it and none of it is sinking in. Others might listen to it, think nothing's sinking in, and then tomorrow you're walking along the road and someone bumps into you. And the thought might arise, this is the flow of life. The flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. Someone bumps into you, not in line with your biological preferences, pain in the moment. And then blame might arise. And another thought, to your surprise, might arise and say, this is suffering. This is my attitude to the flow of life. This is my attitude based on the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. So if these thoughts start arising, these contemplation, we could say, about what is happening in the flow of life, seeing life differently, then the implication is that what has been shared here, new conditioning, has actually become part of your up-to-date conditioning and is starting to function automatically. No one doing it. The body is designed the way it is in that moment, finds itself in circumstance, and as a result of the design of the body and the circumstance, certain thoughts arise. The old attitude might say, that thought is my doing. The new conditioning might recognize that's a happening too, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. I'm not in control of my up-to-date. I had no idea what Roger and Tom were going to talk about last night. I turned up and Roger started talking and all of this stuff came out. And that's new conditioning. That's obviously affected my up-to-date conditioning. I don't know how, but I see that it has. And so the thinking might actually be seen as a happening and not my doing. And the more and more that this set of concepts becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, the more we might start seeing life as a happening and not my doing. And the more that thinking is seen as an object rather than the subject, an output of a biological instrument, an output of the brain, the more that the flow of life is seen as either pleasure or pain, not something that is actually a defining factor on who I am, then witnessing of life automatically starts to happen. And then from our own experience, we might find that there's a peace, there's a detachment from what happens in the flow of life, understanding that the suffering is always attitudinal and not circumstantial. And if that starts happening, we can start putting ticks next to some of the other concepts. My happiness is never to be found in outcomes. My happiness is actually a result of what I am at my core, the essence of the human being. So we haven't spoken about the essence of the human being. We've only spoken about the aspect of the human being that is biological and psychological. At some point, this essence of the human being might actually come into focus. The essence of the human being that was unrecognized, maybe for many, many years. The essence which, at its core, has two functions. The function of awareness and the function of being. And the more we find ourselves resting in this place, the more we realize, what I am at my core is always complete, is actually untouched by what happens in the flow of life. And that resting in being then starts to demonstrate that these beliefs that were in place, The beliefs that held the other as the doer and myself as the doer were wrong, were false. The belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, in pleasure, 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 is not right from my own experience. I am resting here, I'm at peace, and life continues to be pain sometimes, and yet the peace is still available. And the more and more that this understanding goes into the system, the more potential there is for the false beliefs to be uprooted. And when the false beliefs are uprooted, a great load of guilt and blame falls away. A great load of shame and hatred falls away. Plus a load of expectation and worry. A realization, oh, I'm not the doer, I don't need to struggle, I don't need to control life. I've never been in control of life, even when I was struggling, trying to make life a certain way. That was just an attitude. Life was always happening. So this realization means, oh, what great news, I can relax. So at this point, I'll, given there's a sort of framework now presented, there's a microphone here if anyone has any questions at any time or comments, reactions, responses to what has been heard. You're more than welcome to put those forward. I'd ask that for the sake of the recording, you wait for the microphone to come around. There's a button halfway down. If you hold that for a second or two, the green light will come on. If the green light is already on, you don't need to do that. And then you're good to go. And at this stage, Tom, you're very welcome to.
Well, thanks so much, Roger. You nicked a lot of my material.
I won't feel guilty, but I apologize.
Yeah, any questions?
Beware if you don't ask questions, I have lots more to say.
I've got a question. Do I need to hold it? Can you hear me? Okay. It's not related to what you just talked. I have watched your videos before. It's related to one of the video. That question has been on my mind for actually quite a long time now. But I just wanted to clarify so that I can maybe be open to listen more and just be able to absorb more. It's related to, in one of your talk you have mentioned about past, and you said that there, in a way, there is no past, but for us to, as a human, to understand things, we perceive there's a past. You gave example of us experiencing life as from childhood or even before. I don't want to talk about previous life, but just this life. Even for that matter, for us, it's like, okay, we have experienced our childhood, but I'm not able to understand when you said, please explain it a bit more, when you said that that still is us perceiving that childhood, that or whatever's happened before, that past is actually might not be like ever existed, but it's just our. So it's not very much for me to understand that. I'm probably because I'm not any that like spiritual side, but for me that question really bothered me because it felt as if I know from if we see from the consciousness side, it might not be relevant, but for human experience, it's still sometimes important to really feel that happened, that experience we had with our parents, with whatever experience, but it's just you don't want to really feel that it's maybe just us perceiving.
So actually, the last part that you said, really what it's saying is it's important to you. You feel attached to that. You feel it's important, that you wouldn't want that not to be true.
No, I would like to understand, even if it means that I get to understanding that it doesn't need to be true.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be. But it's just for my own understanding what you really meant in that context when you were explaining that there might not be any past.
Yeah. Okay, so just to put it into context, the identity that's in place has taken life, the experience of life, and assumed that it is as experienced. So, in a way, another error gets made where experience is assumed to be a reflection of truth. And once we come to see that life is an experience, is relative in nature, always changing, then this assumption that the relative is absolutely a reflection of truth, that starts to be questioned. And we've heard in many different teachings the concept, the notion that life is an illusion, that life is a dream, that the word Maya is used for confusion. Mm-hmm. The word Leela is used as to describe the play in consciousness, which relates to it being a dream. And so in a night dream, if we look at a night dream, it's the whole night dream world, from our own experience, being able to see it in hindsight, an experience arises in consciousness of the dreamer, and a world comes into existence. A beach, for example, with an ocean. And people are part of that momentary experience that just arose out of nowhere, out of nothing, in the mind of the dreamer, in the consciousness of the dreamer. And so we can come to see, the night dream is an experience arising in consciousness. The experience is very often an experience of time and space. And the character, the protagonist in the dream, arises with the experience. It may be you when you were 15 years old in the dream, or you at current age. And the character in the night dream that spontaneously arises has memories. He has maybe a memory of having breakfast with his wife. Mm-hmm. And from outside we realize, wow, that was inserted in the experience because a moment before the whole universe that character exists in didn't exist. The character themselves didn't exist. The whole night experience is exactly that. It's an experience that once it's there creates the impression of time and space, creates the impression of a past and a potential future, creates the impression that this world is an objective reality, that creates the impression that the dream world is an objective reality based on laws of physics and cause and effect. It creates the impression that the protagonist is the doer, is in control of everything that happens, and that the other is the doer in control of everything that happens. And so suddenly if someone comes along and pushes the main character will react exactly as is destined according to the story, according to the dream, the makeup of the dream. The feeling within the dream is that the character is the doer. The character is a separate independent entity. And that the other that has come up is a doer, a separate independent entity. And there isn't a recognition within the dream that it's actually all a happening, a story, a creation, a masterpiece, we could say, a masterpiece arising in consciousness. And so life may well be similar in nature. In this moment, there is a memory of a past and a future. A memory of a past and a thought that might arise that once this is finished, you'll get on a train or whatever, end up in your bed. So in the experience, there's no doubting that it's designed to appear to be causal, appear to have a past and a future. And in order for a waking up to the fact it is experience, a lot of the ingrained beliefs that have been put in place because of the nature or because of the content of the experience need to be questioned. And so certain awakening teachings, what I call awakening teachings, will tell you that cause and effect is an illusion. Cause and effect is not why things happen. And the past doesn't exist, and the past never existed. All there is now. And it might say that the world is not an objective reality. What you are is not the body. All of these things to get us to start questioning our belief system. And so why I introduced the night dream is because it provides us with a first-hand example that we have a frame of reference to, where we can, from our own experience, realize how real an experience in consciousness can be designed to be experienced. So a night dream is very convincing. And yet in hindsight we realize that that beach that the character was on and the experience was I was that character in an objective world was simply an imagination in consciousness. So if we use that, we can maybe start questioning some beliefs about this experience that without that example we mightn't ever have a basis to question, a basis on which we can question this experience. And it sounds very sort of science fiction like and very fanciful and maybe even crazy. It turns out, though, if we look at what spiritual teachings are pointing at, they're pointing at this very fact that life is an illusion designed to create the impression of something that is not as real as it seems. So when I mention that the past may not actually have happened in the way we think, it's part of a questioning of our belief system. However, if questioning our belief system happens and the beliefs crumble sufficiently for a shift to happen in the experience, whereby the experience is then registered differently, where certain things become evident not as a belief system but based on how the experience presents itself, if that happens, it doesn't change the fact that the experience continues to be there, continues to unfold as a story of cause and effect, continues to include memories of the past, and now no longer relating to them as the way we used to relate to them. They're still there, they'll still produce feelings of nostalgia and pleasure or pain. And so we continue to live as if this is a reality, as if we are the doer, as if time and space is real, deep down remaining connected to our true self, which means the dream, the experience of life. Actually, at some point it's good to drop the word dream, and I prefer to just use the experience of life, carries on, but with a connection now to the part of ourself that was obscured when life was taken to be an objective reality. So we could sum it up and say that when the relative is taken to be absolute, then the true absolute is unseen, because there's a fixation with that which is changing as being real, being absolute, and so they're not categorized correctly. As soon as the relative is put into the right category, as soon as we start seeing the relative as relative, then that which is unchanging maybe presents itself.
So we can say it's a parent past. Sorry. So it's just, we can say it's parent past.
I think you might have turned the microphone off.
Can you hear me? No. So if it is still an experience which we experienced, but if we see from absolute level, it's still what I can say, it's like a dream. So it's still I would say that it's from some level it's still an illusion, but to us it appears as an very real experience when we have experienced it. So maybe that's why to us we feel that past happened, although it's like a dream.
Well, yeah, I would continue to say that I live life as if the past happened.
As if, okay. Yeah.
But as if meaning not pretending. It's in practical terms.
Mm-hmm.
Life continues to be lived with memories, and as if the memories are true. So if a friend, if someone walks in the door, there will in practical terms be a recognition of that person,
Yes.
assuming they are someone that existed in this, what might be an apparent past. In practical terms, hey Tom, nice to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, because that's exactly when I heard that, I felt that you can't deny the fact that you have those memories of the experiences. So I think that's where the confusion, obviously my understanding might not be that where I'm able to understand how you maybe have said. But yeah, it wasn't really like, if I've met an old friend, I can't say, oh, that's just illusion.
Yeah. So you know, that investigation is actually, it's a particular investigation, an investigation into the nature of life experience. Mm-hmm. It's not actually how we will live life, but that investigation starts to reveal aspects of the life experience that maybe weren't registered. And the whole reason for doing that is completely related to what we're really looking for. So how does it relate to happiness for the human being? It relates to happiness for the human being because it starts to become clear that the experience of life demonstrates certain things, implies certain things, but they may not be as real as they seem. That the surface experience might not be the whole story. Yeah. And if we start to see that on investigation, some of the beliefs I have don't necessarily aren't supported as completely as I thought. So seeing that memory is there, but actually it's a thought in the present moment. Is it definitely there because the past happened, or could it just be a thought in the present moment, creating an impression that it happened? And so if we start to see that, then we can start to question the notion of doership. Is it true that I am the doer, or does it just appear that way? So if we take appearance to be a reflection of truth, then we'll say it appears this way, so it's true. If we start to see that an experience can be created to appear a certain way, and it may not be truth. So what this means is it allows us to start questioning our beliefs.
Thank you. Is it possible to try to open
Okay.
Any volunteers to open the windows?
Hi, Roger. So, who's questioning the doership? Who is questioning the doership?
Who is questioning the doership? I don't know. Are you questioning the doership, or in? You mean in? Yeah. So that's a happening too. It's a happening based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning is one way of looking at it. Or it's a happening according to the story of life as it spontaneously arises. The fact that questioning happens from the perspective of a belief in personal doership means if a question arises, there must be a questioner. If thinking happens, there must be a thinker. That's the presupposition. But if we come to see that thinking is an output of a brain, which is part of the body, a brain is essentially a biological machine, part of a larger biological machine, then it makes sense that thinking can happen without there being a thinker. So thinking is actually the product of the biological aspect of the human being. And so questioning a belief is also the function of the brain, and it doesn't imply that there is a separate independent doer that is doing the contemplating. So contemplating is happening as a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and it's mechanical in nature. So let's just put in, I hope that satisfies the question, but it lends me to want to introduce the notion of, so what is the human being? Because I've been speaking about the mechanical aspect of the human being, both on a psychological and a biological level. So the psychological conditioning is the part of the human that believes I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. My happiness is to be found in the flow of life. That's what I'm calling the psychological aspect of the human. We can call it the thinking mind. And the biological aspect of the human, which we can call the working mind, isn't based on those false beliefs. It's simply functional. So the part of the human being that works out how much money to take on holiday, what time to call a cab to get to the airport on time, the part of the human being that knows how to prepare food and can calculate and communicate, all of that is the working mind. And this freedom doesn't come from the end of thinking per se. It comes from the end of the thinking mind functioning. It comes from the end of the psychological function of the human being. Both the psychological and the biological, both based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. We're just saying that the psychological is based on specific up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning that has put in place the specific belief, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So those are the mechanical aspects. What is the complete human being? And in this set of pointers, the human being is described as the combination of the impersonal consciousness of Source that links to a particular body-mind organism and then functions through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. A bit like electricity that plugs into many different appliances, and all the appliances are uniquely designed, and the one electricity that has no particular characteristics except very basic characteristic of energy, let's say in the example of electricity, the one electricity functions through the many different appliances, and according to the appliances makeup, like a computer, let's say, as the hardware and the software. According to the computer's makeup, the output will be a particular thing. And according to the heater, let's say another appliance, the electricity goes in and heat is the output. According to a fan, the electricity goes in and movement is the output. And a refrigerator, cold air is the output. All according to the instrument through which the electricity functions. And so we can start to see, the human experience is a result of this undifferentiated consciousness that is the same, that links to all of the human vehicles and then functions through that instrument. And what is experienced is what we can call personal consciousness. Consciousness from the perspective of a particular instrument. And so the consciousness aspect is not biological, it's not psychological. The consciousness aspect is, in essence, awareness and the sense of existence that inhabits the vehicle, and they're not really two anymore. Once they come together, conceptually we're calling it consciousness of source and the biological instrument. But in practice, what is known is the personal consciousness experience. And the body is always changing. The conditioning of the body is always new, or new conditioning is always coming in, so the up-to-date conditioning is always changing. And so the questioning is part of the biological, the contemplating is thoughts arising, and what is aware of that is the consciousness that functions through the body. It's aware of the complete personal experience, and that complete personal experience, on some level, even once it becomes clear that what I am is not simply a body that produces consciousness. That consciousness is not a result of the body, and one way that I like to sort of undermine that belief is that the consciousness, whenever we rest there, it's always the same. The nature of consciousness is awareness and the sense of being. And the body is always changing, so the body is relative, and it's not palatable to me that a relative changing instrument can be the source of something that is always the same. So the idea that the consciousness is actually a product of the body, that the body is the source, just doesn't gel with me.
So you could sort of summarize it saying that happiness would be true understanding, as opposed to what ignorance is. Ignorance is the opposite, isn't it? Suffering. So the more this is seen, the more it will function properly.
Yes, I think in hindsight, or if we were to describe the difference after certain beliefs have fallen away, we could say while the beliefs are in place, the assumption is that what I am is essentially this physical entity, the body. Maybe consciousness is understood to be part of that, but actually probably it's more fair to say that before any falling away of the beliefs, the assumption based on the experience is essentially I am this body, separate and independent from everything else. And after the beliefs fall away, it's more akin to say what I am is connected to something, not functioning independent. That Roger is a personal experience, a result of a source that has linked to the body and is using the body as a vehicle. And so with that understanding, knowing that what I am at my essence doesn't originate in the body, comes the end of the fear of death. Because when death comes, it can be clearly seen as the demise of the vehicle. If I believe myself to be the vehicle, then death is the ultimate attack on who I am. If I know myself to be the consciousness that is unchanging regardless of the changeability of the vehicle, then life as an experience becomes inherently known, and death of the body means the end of the Rogeness experience. That's just known to be the end of a chapter, the end of experience. And what I am at my core doesn't have to die with experience.
Thank you.
My question is regarding this quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj. I quote, "That which resides in all beings, and all beings reside in that, in which I am that." I'd like you to, it's a beautiful quote. I get goosebumps every time I hear it or think about it. I'd like you to say a few words on that. And also if you could say a few words on one of the analogies you gave on YouTube, where you mentioned how in a dream, you have a dreamer who's sitting on the sand, there's water, so there's all these different things, physical objects within the dream. You have yourself, you have the other, you have the water, you have the sand. But then when you wake up, you realize that water was made of dream stuff, and so was the sand, so was you, so was everything else. And just like that, how that relates to this experience today, and how this is ultimately linked to that consciousness which appears as so many different material things. So that's my question.
A nice simple question. Good. That's what I like. I'm it's your turn now, Tom. Tom.
My go. Thanks, Roger.
I mean, given...
I think it's probably worth me saying something.
Yeah, I think so. Good.
Bhupinder, I'm actually not going to answer your question directly, because I think what's interesting about Roger and I being here together today is also people having opportunities to watch us interact and see how that goes. So we can come back to your question. That's no problem. I know you live quite locally, so you can come along and we can talk about that at a future time if we don't get round to it in this meeting. One thing I wanted to ask Roger actually is, just based on the conversations you've been having with a couple of the audience members here, we had one question that was talking about the past and the future and time. And we had another question which ended up, the way you talked about the answer in terms of consciousness, whether consciousness comes from the body or whether consciousness is something distinct from the body. So I just wanted, and these are two massive topics that often come up for many seekers. We hear many different teachings on these things. It can be incredibly confusing to navigate. I thought it might be quite interesting for people here to see an interaction between you and me and how we approach these subjects. So you hear it, as you mentioned, you hear a teaching like, there is no time. Time is an illusion. Okay, so answer me straight. Does time exist? Is time an illusion?
So you don't want to hear a it does and it doesn't?
I don't want any like messing around. I don't want any kind of like long-winded answers. Not that you would give long-winded answers, but I just want, yes, no, don't know. Is time an illusion? Does it exist? What's the answer? Come on, give us something.
So from one perspective it exists, and from the other perspective it doesn't.
Okay. So, okay.
And I can elaborate, because I guess if someone hears that, it might not be very satisfying. I often hear this is like a yes, it's both. And I go, no, come on, don't tell me it's both. Because that's a bit of a cop-out. Like, if it's both, I want to know why it's both. But that's going to be long-winded.
Sure, okay. Well, let me tell you my perspective then, and maybe you can bounce off that. So my perspective is I don't know.
I'll run with that. I don't either.
Which is different to saying from one perspective it's true and one perspective it's not true. See, I think the thing is, there's definitely the appearance of time in my experience. And through talking to other people, it appears that other people also have an experience of time. We remember getting up in the morning We remember what it was like to be a child, etc., etc. So there's an experience of time. Do I know that experience of time means that there is actually time? Well, I don't know for sure, because as you really nicely put, in a dream, it appears as this whole time. There's this whole notion of time. You might have, in your dream, you might have had a really wonderful, beautiful childhood and grown up in the house of a millionaire, whatever it is. And then when you wake up, you realise, gosh, that timeline which I believe to be true in the dream is actually not true. Maybe there's a different explanation for what I'm experiencing. So when I look at the experience that's presented to me, I say, well, there's a presentation of experiences having time. Do I know 100% for sure that time exists? I don't. There could be, who knows what the explanation is for this experience. But can I say there's no time? Well, maybe there is time. Maybe there was a yesterday. And I think to take any extreme is going where the evidence doesn't lead us. So what I say is that's going too far. Because to say there's no time, is there evidence? Do you have solid evidence there's no time? We don't, but we can question it. And you say there is time, well, do we have solid evidence there is time? Well, actually, it's not rock solid. This could be a dream. We could be all in a computer simulator.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's a real freedom in hearing a teacher actually say, you know, we're all self-proclaimed teachers, aren't we? We're all up here, self-proclaimed teachers. But there's value, I think, and there's freedom for a seeker to hear the notion that actually maybe we don't know. Now, so then what do you do? One of the things that Preet mentioned in her question was how if you are you willing to think of life as an illusion? I mean, one of the things for me was when I remember I was just looking at my wife, and I was thinking to myself, is she an illusion? And this was when I was a seeker, you know. And now I look at my kids and I think, are they just illusions? You know, I've watched them grow up. I've nurtured them to the best of my ability. All these things. Was that all just an illusion? Was that just like that didn't happen? That's not real. See, my experience is that those things were experienced. They definitely are experienced. And in that experience, this is what happens. This is life. Life happens. Do I know it's real for sure? I don't know. I'll tell you something else. I don't know if any of you guys are real. I don't know for sure. 100% sure. I don't know if any of you guys are real. But how could I know? I know there's a presence here, but I don't know. I make the assumption that in each of every one of these bodies here, there's a consciousness and a mind. Because when I interact with them, the circumstantial evidence makes that appear to be true. Do I know 100% that's true? I don't. But I make that assumption knowingly, and the body-mind here acts that way. Do I know if time exists? I don't know. So that's my take on time. I would say, you thought it was wishy-washy to say, yes and no, did you say? Or
well, yes and no is taking essentially the position.
It's a cop-out, you thought, isn't it?
Well, unless it can be explained. And my explanation would be what you very eloquently put forward. Okay.
Because then if you say it is from one perspective and it isn't from another perspective, that can also lead to confusion, couldn't it?
It could. That's why I don't think it's a very eloquent teaching to just leave it at that. Yeah.
And then I'd say same for consciousness as well. Is consciousness dependent on the body? Because this is a scientific question as well, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And as someone who's a medical doctor, I've got a science background. There's something that really bugged me when I was listening to all these teachings saying, you're aware of the body, you are that which is aware of the body, therefore you're not the body, therefore when the body dies, you're still there. And I thought, oh, well, hang on a sec, that's a massive jump. There's a jump from like, okay, you're aware of the body, check, got that one. You are not the body, a bit iffy now. And then, therefore, when you die, You just kind of, you hear stories of some teachers saying, they're telling you what's going to happen in the future. When I die in the future, which doesn't exist, when I die in the future, it's just the body slipping away. I can imagine this like three-dimensional body becoming a two-dimensional sheet of paper, kind of just slipping away. So, and as consciousness, I'm just sort of, here, and then the body just slips away. Do we know that to be true? Do you know that to be true?
No.
Do you know that consciousness survives death?
No. So, it sounds contradictory. Hang on a sec. A second ago you just said maybe something similar, although I'm very careful with my words, so if we listen to the recording, maybe what someone heard or thought I said might not be if we really look at it what I said. So someone said, well, anyway, at times you say that what the human being is consciousness of source functioning through a body as personal consciousness. Tom could say, do you really know that the consciousness is coming from source? Have you been given some special information I haven't? And I'd say, no, I don't know that. Well, why do you say it? Okay, it's a teaching. So this, in a way, sometimes, I'm very passionate about this subject and teaching, and sometimes when I talk about this, I feel like I'm giving away a secret, that's not meant to be given away. I sort of almost wonder if a lightning bolt is going to come down and strike me when I'm saying this. But actually, I also think very much the opposite, that because it's coming out, it's very much meant to be said. That it's about time that we start understanding this process and what is actually happening in the change that happens. That everything that delivered is a teaching. No teacher has ever uttered a word of truth. Nothing that has ever been written or said is truth. And sometimes we come across very profound teachings that are talking about reality as opposed to, illusion. And then the experience starts to demonstrate that this is accurate, because the experience, remember it's an experience, starts to demonstrate that. And we think they're talking about the truth. And Ramana very eloquently uses the explanation, use this thorn to uproot the thorn embedded in your thumb, but be sure to throw both thorns away. The thorn is a concept. When it's embedded in your thumb, it's a thorn that has been related to as truth. It's become a belief and it's a hindrance. And so use a spiritual teaching concept to uproot the concept embedded in your thumb, and then be sure to throw both thorns away. But he doesn't throw that in because he feels confident that people are going to throw both thorns away, because they've heard that. I think it's included because it's very clearly seen by someone who becomes familiar with the process that inevitably the spiritual teaching concept is going to be taken as a new belief, and at some point it needs another teaching or another concept needs to point that out, and then we drop the thorn that is embedded in the thumb, the belief I am consciousness, for example. And so everything that is put forward is essentially a concept that is not the truth, but is really powerful as a teaching, is there to undo an existing belief that needs to be undone. And so the seeker, according to this magnificent creation of life, receives the teaching, remembering life has put in place all the misunderstandings as well, receives the teaching as a truth, believes it, and that can be very important at a certain point, because if it's just treated as a concept, it might not have the power to uproot the ingrained belief. So it's received as a truth, it replaces the old belief, becomes a new problem, but it's a problem that is more easily undone at the right time. So remember, I'm sure I said it at the beginning. Everything that being put forward here is a concept. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, I say that over and over again in the talks, and I know that it won't be heard, and in a way it's great that it's not heard for a period of time, and when it's the right time, it'll be heard in the teaching, and someone will go, oh. Even the idea that time doesn't exist or time exists, it's a concept. And when we're just present with what is, I don't know where this consciousness comes from. I don't know if it comes from the body, it doesn't tell me. From one perspective, the experience tells me it comes from the body. From another perspective, it tells me that the body arises inside the awareness. And I don't know which one it is, because I can keep switching perspectives and they're both indicated. And then from another perspective, it tells me it's neither. And at the end of the day, I go, it's not important as long as the process has undone the beliefs that cause suffering. When they've done that, uncomfortableness with life falls away, and we find I'm at peace regardless of what happens. And who cares where this consciousness comes from? Who cares whether time or space exists or not? The fact is that the experience has now changed, and in practical terms, I see it's changed because life brought about all this reconditioning. And in the end, I live life as if I'm a human being, not knowing whether I am or I'm not. And frankly, I say it's irrelevant, because what I'm really looking for is happiness in this life for Roger. Happiness is the end of suffering, and to the extent that the process has brought about that, and as I see it, it brings about that as a result of reprogramming the body, so the body no longer functions in the way it used to, no longer produces certain thoughts and feelings, then I'm eternally grateful for the fact that that's the experience here. And I'm not going to fight anyone over any of their beliefs.
Okay, I've got some other things to say then. Thank you, by the way. So happiness doesn't depend on outcomes, you said. And you mentioned pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Could happiness be a result of pleasure, pleasure, pleasure? Isn't it possible that I just haven't found the right thing? And just around the corner, there's a teaching or an experience, or maybe like some kind of meditation practice I can do that will take me to that next level, so that I will be in some kind of samadhi type experience, and it will be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Because I like the sound of that. What do you think?
Well,
what's wrong with that? What's wrong with thinking that way?
Well, yes, we can maintain that idea, but in principle we'll see that's the belief that I've had my whole life. It's a belief I've been working hard on my whole life, finding the right pleasure.
But I just haven't found the right.
I haven't found the right one yet.
You know, I know I've been trying that, but just over there. I think it's just going to be over there, the next one.
Yeah. So we know from our own experience that there's been that time when we say, God, just give me this job promotion, please. After that, I'll be yours. You know, just this, please. I know this is going to, inside we know the assumption this is it. When we get that, everything's going to be okay. And God hears us and says, okay, you can have the job promotion. And we get it, and what happens is we're completely disappointed. And so we then go on to the next thing, the next pleasure. And over again this happens. And so the suggestion is you can keep going down that path, Because maybe you just haven't found the right one. You know that soulmate that you prayed for and you got? They weren't the right one, were they? So you can keep going that path, or you might be able to say, if it's destined according to one's genes and conditioning, actually, I've followed that path for long enough. Not only me, but the other 7 billion also following this path. My dad told me where happiness would be found. Look at him. Why am I listening to him? He's coming. We're all going the same place. Not many people seem to have this, and in fact, the ones that have it tell you, stop going there. It's not over there. So I can't convince someone. It's only about putting forward a rationale that maybe will be received. And if it is received, and the brain just stops at some point because it realizes that the suffering includes this movement outwards to try and find something out there, if there is an openness to just, I'm going to try something different, and a stop happens, then it's not a concept anymore. Then we have our own experience that says, who would have thought? My thinking mind was telling me, obviously, you're looking for something you don't have. It's got to be out there somewhere, otherwise, and you've got to go and get it. And then stop happens because a notion that maybe it's not to be found out there is introduced. And from our own experience, we might know.
I think you're right that you can't really convince someone that, you use the word outcomes. In the way I teach, I use the word objects, which is incredibly, very, very similar way of talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I say happiness, lasting fulfillment. You can't get that from objects.
Mm-hmm.
And I define an object as being anything you can perceive.
Mm-hmm.
And I say you've got gross objects like tables and chairs that you can see or feel or touch with your senses, your 5 senses. And then you've got the subtle objects, which is everything else, like your thoughts, your feelings, and experiences. And I say, these, when you contact an object, you might feel pleasure. It might be momentary, it might last for a while, it might last for a long time. But no object leads to lasting satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And people seek pleasure and happiness and fulfillment in objects. And I think you're right, you can't really convince someone not to carry on doing that. And eventually life will sort of show someone, maybe not, but maybe life will show you that fulfillment doesn't reside in objects. But one thing think that helps is if you point out that objects come and go. Anything that arises in to your life, or if you're into the consciousness type teachings, anything that arises in your consciousness also has the capacity to fall away.
Mm-hmm.
So if your happiness is dependent on something that's arising, a gross or a subtle object, then your happiness is dependent on something that's inherently unstable or unstable. Is unstable even a word? I think I made that one up. Unstable. Thank you. So, and then if you have an object, those objects are subject to decay and old age and destruction, and you have to protect them. You have to keep them, don't you?
Mm.
And even when you've got them, you could be worried about losing them. You might have amassed everything you need to be happy. Whatever that is for you. Maybe it's the relationship or a house or a career, whatever it is. And you've got everything now in place. It's like the pieces on the chessboard are all just in the perfect position now. And freeze, just keep it there. Just keep it there. And that's incredibly painful, trying to keep everything just there, because life's inherently changing. So I think hearing that teaching, as you say, Roger, when a seeker's hearing these words are updating their conditioning. I mean, that can trigger something. It's an analytical, logical process. but just the recognition that experiences themselves are objects. So a samadhi, in the way I teach, that's an Indian or a Sanskrit word, that often it tends to mean some kind of blissful experience or some sort of higher state of consciousness. If you experience a higher state of consciousness, that is also an object that appears, that is known, that you're aware of. So even that can go. And just reflecting upon those truths, that if your happiness is dependent upon an object or an outcome, as you put it, then it's inherently unstable.
And we're not looking for an unstable happiness.
Exactly, and what this teaching is pointed towards is a stability in a way. It's something that's here, and it's available, and it doesn't come and go.
Yeah. So would you agree? Because often I'll ask the question of a teaching and a teacher. So what's the teaching going to deliver? Or what's the understanding that will come from this teaching? What's it going to deliver after that wasn't there before?
It's all the same, Roger. It's all the same. Nothing changes. There's no change. It's like, what's the fucking point? It's because you don't get it. That kind of thing, I guess. You come across sometimes, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. And some teachings, they'll just repeat the teaching, which is fine, because a teaching is a teaching, and you've got to, your job is to deliver the teaching. But sometimes I think a question like this, so in practical terms, once there's a realization that this is all there is, or that there's a oneness or whatever, that which the teaching as a methodology is hammering home. So in practical terms, what is delivered? What's different?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. And again, it's one of the many things that we have, and we've been chatting today before this meeting for quite a while. And there's so much in common in the way we share this. And one of the things that I teach in a structured way. So I teach several sessions, and in the first session we say, what is this teaching about? What are we actually looking for? And I usually say happiness or lasting fulfillment. It's something lasting, because is there a benefit to the teaching? And if there's no benefit to the teaching, what's the point? You don't have to be here. What are we looking for? And I say, lasting fulfillment, or a better definition is a negative definition, perhaps, which is the lack of suffering. So you can start off by saying something like happiness, and happiness can become a subtle object which you can chase. And I think it's just there again, around that corner there. But that's thinking of happiness as an object, a present. But really, what we're talking about is removing suffering. And what you said today is that suffering is caused by a false belief, essentially, and a few other things that go with that. And it's that falling away of those false beliefs that actually allows us to realize, experience a life happening, free, flowing. I do that because it doesn't have to be kind of all like, hey, it's all just happening, and it can be a bit sticky along the way. But there's a freedom there, and the resistance to what's happening becomes so much nicer, becomes so much easier. And even if resistance occurs, again, that's accepted because the belief in doership isn't there, isn't it?
And attachment.
And attachment to outcomes.
Mm.
Absolutely right. I had another question. What was it? So one was about why I shouldn't carry on seeking happiness and outcomes. And hopefully we're getting an idea of that. Another question I want to say is that gosh, all these concepts, Roger. You know, all these concepts, like all this words. You're firing all these words at us, man. I mean, isn't spirituality about silence?
Yes.
And you know, where's the love and the space? All this kind of talking. What's that about? Can you help me out with that one?
Yeah, well, you see, as I see it, some teachings will tell us that this has got nothing to do with the intellect. And why is that the case? That's what I ask. Why does it say that? And I had my own answer, because it's a teaching that is specifically designed to undo an error that gets in the way of happiness. And often, because of the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes, there is a huge movement of the mind. And so being told that it has nothing to do with thinking can be very useful at eventually bringing about a stop, where thinking is recognized as being the problem, and at some point there's a spontaneous realization, stop. So a teaching that tries to bring about that will make an effort at pointing out that liberation has got nothing to do with the intellect. And I agree that liberation itself is not an intellectual movement. Liberation is the movement of self, our true nature functioning effortlessly in the way that it does when a false idea of who we are isn't functioning on top of it. However, from what I can see, the process itself is completely about the mind. All of the change that happens that eventually leads to this silence is change on the level of the body and the mind. And a teacher that is delivering a teaching that says, you know, it's got nothing to do with the intellect, is delivering information to the intellect. In order for the intellect to realize that the intellect is the problem. And at some point, when the intellect, the working mind, sees what's being pointed at, a stop can happen. And so when we listen to the concepts here, as I mentioned, everything that is said is only said for one reason, because it's completely relevant to human happiness. And what it's really saying is that all of the concepts are simply bringing awareness onto a functioning that is happening, a functioning that at some point is suffering, and what we can come to know through the intellect and through experience as my unhappiness. And then it describes why that functioning is happening, on what basis. It's all intellect, I would call the part of the intellect that's been very badly conditioned to then include false beliefs. Not our doing, we didn't get it wrong. Life specifically put that conditioning in place in order for life to be the experience it is, an experience of suffering. So I'd like to call life a story of time and space, a story whereby our essence has been forgotten and suffering therefore happens. And at some time that forgetting falls away, and there's a realization, a remembering, and suffering comes to an end. So life is a story of duality, a story of forgetting ourselves, suffering, remembering ourselves, and suffering ending. All are happening moment by moment, exactly as it's destined to happen. And along the way, the forgetting gets dissolved through very different mechanisms, all of which I believe in practice, when we really look at it, is not a shift in consciousness. Consciousness doesn't become more complete. We never become more conscious or more aware. Consciousness itself is always fully conscious of the experience. When the experience includes certain objects, certain thought objects that have a certain resonance or makeup, then the experience has to be experienced as it is when we feel separate and uncomfortable. And when the experience changes, then the awareness hasn't grown, hasn't developed, hasn't matured. The awareness is the same awareness that was aware of the uncomfortableness. The content of the experience is now different, and it appears like there's a shift. It seems like the change has happened because there's a shift in consciousness. Actually, the shift is a shift on the level of the body and the mind. It's a shift whereby the thinking no longer insists as destined, no longer insists on the experience being the old way. And now the experience is something different. So the concepts are there because they deliver information to the working mind, specifically to counteract the misunderstanding. And for some people, this teaching is completely unpalatable. Just like if you put some people who are here that find it palatable into a teaching of bhakti yoga where there's lots of devotion, it will be completely unpalatable. Just different makeups. And so for some people, it's like, thank you. Someone is now explaining in simple everyday English in a way I can actually understand. And what the feedback that's given, and I know from my own experience, is that as this information goes into the system, automatically, as someone goes through life, the suffering that used to have a basis on which to arise now starts getting cut off quicker and quicker and quicker. Simply because the working mind has been equipped, essentially, reconditioned with new information in such a way that it picks up the error and cuts it off. And before that was the case, the error continued to function with the assumption within the brain itself that this is not an error, this is actually very helpful to blame someone. Somehow it's very helpful to have expectations in the future. It's very helpful for me to feel guilty. And when the working mind is informed, actually that's your suffering. That's your unhappiness. Then it turns out, in my experience, based on an observation, that it's the mind that changes the mind. Once again, a concept that some teachings say the mind can't fix the mind. But if we create a conceptual split and introduce the notion of the thinking mind and the working mind, then it starts to be apparent that we can equip the working mind, and the working mind plus awareness starts catching out the functioning of the thinking mind. And then it's the working mind that throws up a thought and says, actually, this is expectation, and my happiness is not to be found in outcome. And it gets cut off. And when blame arises, the working mind registers it and says, this is suffering in the form of blame. Blame is based on the belief the other is the doer and I'm the doer. And if the working mind has contemplated to the point where it's realized that everything that happens is a result of the body's genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstances they find themselves in, then the thought will arise, I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer, and the blame falls away. Sorry for all the words.
Actually, one of Nisargadatta Maharaj's contemporaries, Ranjit Maharaj, they both had the same guru. He used to say that ignorance is in the mind. Ignorance being that which causes suffering. Ignorance is in the mind. It's caused by something going on in the mind. Therefore, the solution is in the mind. Mm-hmm. So it's by, and one way of removing ignorance is using the mind to remove the ignorance. So using a thorn, using a concept to remove a concept, and throwing them both away. Using a thorn to remove a thorn, throwing both away. And Ramana Maharshi used to talk about his teachings like a stick in the funeral pyre. Have you heard that one?
I haven't, but you just...
So it's the same thing, basically. But he used to say, my teachings, or he used to say self-inquiry, atma vichara. Self-inquiry is like a stick. It's a pretty morbid analogy here. But a stick to prod the body on the funeral pyre, the cremation pyre. and burn the body up. And then at the end, you throw the teaching, you throw the stick onto the funeral pyre, and it's all gone. So you don't hold on to the teaching. That's the key, isn't it? The key is that you don't take the teaching. But then what's the point of the teaching? Well, it's useful. It's the stick to prod the funeral pyre, the thorn to remove the thorn. It has its use. It's just like using a ladder to climb up a building. It has its use. And then when you're on top, unless you need to get down again, you don't need the ladder anymore. Maybe that wasn't such a good analogy. The Buddha had the better one with the boat, didn't he? Going to the other side of the river. And then you don't need one. Again, if you want to come back or you want to help someone else across, these teachings have huge value. But I think the other thing that comes out of what you're saying, perhaps, is that this teaching isn't the best teaching.
No. It's a teaching.
It's a teaching. So wait a sec, does that mean we're not the best teachers?
Well, amongst them.
I like it. I like that.
Can I just say something here? So I've been listening to you, and I think that the purpose of the teaching is pointing to the I am. And I think there was a really valid question here, and I wish you could answer the question.
I would invite you to rephrase the question and ask it for if it's what the question is from your point of view, how you heard the question, and because really the questions work when they come from a genuine place. So
When you're sorry?
the questions really work when they come from a genuine place, in my experience. So what's your question then?
You're talking about concepts, and if we'll put to the side the concepts, I would really love to hear about the I am, which is, for me, the main teaching is to point people to the I am and to immerse together in this I am.
So what do we need to talk about then? Why don't you just do it?
There are ways to point.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm letting you to lead the way.
Shall I take that one?
By all means, yeah.
Okay, I think I don't think there is any one particular teaching. I wouldn't say for me that the purpose of the teaching is to point to the I am. I wouldn't say, I think there are different ways for different people. The purpose is, so I think that the way I teach is pretty good. I think it was really effective for people who resonate with the way I teach. Traditionally, there's sort of two main ways of teaching, or you could maybe say four. There are different ways of categorizing, but keep it really simple. There are two main ways of teaching. There's one that's about relaxation into the I am, or you can call that self-surrender. You can also call that devotion or bhakti. And all those eventually end up in just being. Roger earlier mentioned that the thing about the awareness is it has two qualities: the fact that it is here and ever present, and the fact that it is aware and knowing. So you can call it a knowing presence. And that's essentially one way of talking about the I am. In Sanskrit, that which is always present is called sat, and the knowingness is called chit. So we're talking about the ever-present sat, chit. That's always there, whether we're aware of it or not. Now, what happens when we're allowed to just relax and be with that? It's quite beautiful, really. then when we relax and the egoic tendencies fall away, maybe just temporarily even, you can talk about this in different ways, but you can start to feel connected. You can start to feel looser and freer. Whew, the heart can open. And the bliss, the happiness, the ananda, which is the Sanskrit word for happiness actually. It just means happiness. The ananda can rise up within us. So through being with the presence awareness, the happiness is felt. And every time we look for happiness in an object, or as Roger puts it, an outcome, you're moving away from that, and the ananda is suppressed, and then the suffering comes, and the connection, the wholeness starts to dissipate. So we can use that as almost like a homing pigeon, this one way. And if you're drawn to that way, you don't need any of these concepts necessarily. If you're really drawn to that way, you just stay there. You just stay in the I am. Traditionally, that's in some of the Vedanta texts, that's called yoga. There's a text called Advaita Bodha Deepika, which talks about that is the yogic path. And then the concept, to remove a concept, that's the inquiry path, the self-inquiry path. And some people are naturally, and this is very much me, I want to know, I want questioning, I want to know, want to hear about it, want to talk about it, want to understand it. And so, for me, very much an inquiry path. But for other people, it's going to be more a heart-based connection to start off with. They take you to the same place. And the I am, it's a beautiful teaching. Rest in the I am. The only point of the teaching then is just to remind you. If that's your path, you know, satsang is very different. You don't have to, well, it might be the same. It might externally, superficially be the same. But actually it's just about connecting to this presence, awareness, bliss. This sat, chit, ananda. And staying with it. And over time, that dissolves all the egoic tendencies. Because we're staying there. We're not allowing the ego to rise up. We're not allowing the desire to look for pleasure and outcomes to keep on coming up and pushing us this way and pushing us to that object and putting us to this outcome. Every time we have something coming up saying, I'm going to grab that one, that one's going to make me happy. We remember the teaching is, that's taking away from my ananda. That's taking me away from this fulfillment and happiness, which is already here in the sense that it's always available. But it's not always manifest unless the mind is loosened. And then over time, that egoic tendency towards grasping a sense of self, towards grasping fulfillment in an object, over time disappears. It's a very natural, harmonious path. And traditionally it's often talked about as being a much longer path. It just takes a lot longer, generally speaking. Again, Ranjit Maharaj, this contemporary of Nisargadatta Maharaj, he used to talk about it, I think it was, he talks about it being the slow way and the quick way. Have you come across his teachings? Can you remember the analogy he used? It's like the bird's
the
path. The
bird path and the ant path.
The ant and the bird, that's right. And I think a couple of gurus above their guru used to teach the ant's path. He used to teach the path of meditation and yoga. And Ranjit Maharaj and Nisargadatta Maharaj, they both taught the bird's way. It's the quick way, it's the direct way. Much quicker. Which one's better? The one that's better is the one that works for you, the one that you resonate with. But, oh gosh, I mean, it's such a lovely teaching. You don't need to talk about it, you need to do it.
Yeah. But also...
just relax.
You were mentioning the pleasure, the grasping the pleasure. But there's also enjoying the pleasure without having to grasp it. So there is a natural movement towards the pleasure, even when we are not clinging to it.
Yeah, sure. It can be. And in this freedom, definitely, you know. The way I teach, I often talk about ice creams, and you might Maybe you prefer vanilla ice cream. Maybe you prefer chocolate ice cream. But at the end of the day, if you don't have any ice cream, the way the teaching goes anyway, I don't know how true this is, but the way the teaching goes is that when you don't get any ice cream, it's not a big deal. It's okay. But when the opportunity presents itself, if that's what you're into, you can go for it. However, in the yogic path, one of the important principles and safeguards of the yogic path is to turn away from objects. You see, when the teaching's done, you don't need to turn away from objects. There's nothing to turn away from, it's all here. But in the teaching, the methodology, the purpose of abiding the I am is specifically to turn you away from objects and say, no, when you want that chocolate ice cream, don't indulge in that. You need to get your satisfaction and pleasure from the I am. And if you're getting your satisfaction from the ice cream, very, very naughty, very naughty. You're not following the yogic path. You've just deviated from the yogic path. You're now just indulging in sense pleasures, you evil person. So the yogic path, the way it's structured, is that you turn away from the objects of the world, and you depend on yourself for happiness. And over time, that breaks the addiction, the addictive process, these vasanas, these addictive habitual tendencies that pull us out and say we need those things, well, we don't. And then when that's broken, when that knot of the ego has been cut, then you don't need to avoid, or there's nothing to avoid or not avoid, or it's just life happening. But that's the methodology of the yogic path, of the abiding in the I am. It's my view. What do you think, Roger?
I agree. There is a nice way that we can tie it all up, especially in the end, because often I talk about my relationship to Nisargadatta's teaching, that essentially, he said that my guru said, abide in I am. I trusted him, and after 3 years there was self-realization. So through Nisargadatta's teaching over and over, it points to abide in I am. And at some point, this abiding in I am became a practice that at the time I saw wasn't really a practice, it was just happening automatically. There wasn't a practicer of the practice. And how the practice was happening was very much linked with all the concepts. It used the concepts in order for the practice to happen. And I noticed that the teachings that came before made it very clear that the error is attachment to outcome. It's the belief I'm the doer. And it made it clear that that's the suffering that covers up our natural state. And that wherever possible, whenever possible, our freedom and our peace comes from knowing ourselves, and abiding in I am is a direct experience of who we are. And so the practiceless practice that started to happen was when awareness landed on the products of what Tom and I are speaking about, the suffering. When awareness and the working mind recognized this is suffering in its different forms, so it actually knows the suffering through a sense, a feeling of an uncomfortableness. So the working mind has registered that this suffering is an uncomfortable feeling, and it also is equipped with a more intellectual understanding of what that uncomfortableness is: guilt, blame, pride, expectation, worry. And so whenever awareness and the working mind landed on the fact that suffering was happening, there was an understanding, this is my unhappiness, this is what keeps me away from I am, and a thought arose. And in this case, the thought was I am. The thought I am arose because teachings, Nisargadatta's teachings, I think suggested this. The thought I am might arise. Very clear, the thought I am might arise. And that thought includes in it all of your wisdom that the teachings have delivered to the working mind. So the thought I am arises and sort of bookends, it becomes the full stop to the obsessive thinking that's happening in that moment, that has been recognized to be suffering, recognized not to be helpful, recognized to be a mistake based on these beliefs, and understood that these beliefs on investigation are not as true. So that understanding means they can just stop in that moment and nothing's lost. Actually, what's lost is the veil that keeps us separated from this being. So time and time again, awareness and the working mind lands on suffering. The thought, I am, arises, and a dropping into being happens. The suggestion that we can open our gaze and allow everything to fit into the field of awareness, allow the center of consciousness to drop into the chest, which is where it's much easier to sense this being. So along with the arising of the thought, I am, which effectively bookends the obsessive thinking, this opening gaze dropping into being. And maybe for half a second, there's this experiential sense of existence. I am. And at first, the mind has such a momentum that we get dragged out, maybe after half a second, and we don't even realize we're dragged out until 10 minutes later. Awareness lands on the thinking again, and we're, oh wow, I remember, I am, but I've been caught in thinking for 10 minutes without even realizing it. And in that moment it's realized, and the thought, I am, drop into being. And once again, it might be half a second. And this can happen 20 times in a day or 30 times in a day. It doesn't require us to stop doing whatever we're doing. And hopefully we don't see it as my doing, not I am practicing this. That automatically when suffering is recognized, the thought I am comes up and stops. And then we drop into being, which is not the thought I am, that's just being. Which from some perspective we can appreciate, the word I am is such a perfect description for this being, not I as a personal I, but this impersonal existence. And as this process goes on for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we might find that the period of time that we drop into being extends from half a second to a second to 5 seconds to 15 seconds. And eventually, when this cutting off of the suffering has happened enough, and experientially we start to know for ourselves this beingness, which is the core of the human being, we might one day find that that's where we rest, and we live life from here, doing in each moment what needs to be done. The body still moving towards pleasure and away from pain based on its biological conditioning, but no longer with the beliefs of needing something to be a certain way, so the attachment isn't there. And then we can say, this is my home, the heart is the home, and yet life can still be lived, doing in each moment what needs to be done. So that's a way that I think we can tie and see how they're very connected, all the concepts, hopefully at the end of the day just lead to an ending and a being.
May I ask a question? If you finished. You're okay with that? You spoke about connection. First of all, thank you for being here. And you spoke about connection before, and it seemed to imply, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're speaking about an impersonal way of being, just simply being. And it seems that when life is being received from this space, there seems to be a quality of intimacy with it. So my question is, does the sense of separation have to disappear for this intimacy to be present, for it to be lived?
So I now realize how little, in a sense, of because these are such valid questions and we have limited time, and so not everything gets covered in a short period of time. And I realize that a lot of very valid stuff hasn't been covered. It never is in a satsang, because maybe 2 or 3 satsangs are needed. And this is a very important point. We hear so much about oneness and the end of separation, and so we're waiting for an experience where there is no separation. And these experiences happen, they do exist, and when they happen, there is sometimes very understandably a conclusion that's formed in the head that says, this is it. This separation has fallen away. My experience of life as a duality has fallen away, and this is the oneness, this is reality, this is what's spoken about. And in that profound experience, there are a lot of things, including peace, but also some states. It is a state, it's a shift, it's very different to maybe how we've experienced life. And if that idea is taken on as truth, it becomes an expectation, because inevitably that oneness experience tends to fade away. And then the belief says, it happened, that was awakening, and liberation I'm on the right track, and liberation isn't far away. And liberation is when that experience comes back, and I live in that experience forever. And so this happened to me. I speak from personal experience, and I went to Mumbai, where Ramesh, my teacher, was, and I described this in great detail, this falling away of subject-object relationship, this oneness experience, which I wasn't calling an experience then. This was non-experience. This was reality. That there was a very clear recognition that what I was as subject is awareness in which everything arises. That what arises is not separate from the awareness in which it arises, and is witnessed by the awareness in which it arises. And at that time, my language was very good relating to these onenesses. So I put this forward to Ramesh in really what I thought was a really great description. And he listened patiently, and at the end he said, Roger, don't worry about it, it was just an experience. And nothing inside of me sort of resonated with that answer, and I thought, no, I didn't communicate this properly. So I had another go. I corrected what I thought was a very good description. I corrected it. I said, no, but you don't understand. This wasn't an experience. This was the end of experience. This is reality as described in all the other teachings. I saw the truth. And anyway, he listened, and then, Roger, that was just an experience. Don't worry about it. Okay. One more time, so a few more corrections. Third time, patiently, Roger, that was just an experience, don't worry about it. So I left unsatisfied, basically coming to the conclusion, maybe he doesn't know. It hasn't happened to him. And so I went back to Australia, which is where I lived, and this happened on a morning walk. And whenever I'd get to the same place, I made sure I went the same path all the time. And I could feel myself bracing myself, like getting to the same place, and it didn't happen. And at some point, because I was very familiar with what suffering felt like, thanks to these teachings, at some point it became very clear, I'm suffering because I have an expectation of what enlightenment is, what it looks like. And in that moment, it clicked, what if he's right? The first time in that moment that his words actually there was any receptivity to their correctness, their accurateness. And it clicked. The whole teaching, because it says what you're really looking for is the end of suffering, happiness for the human being. It doesn't say what you're looking for is a oneness experience. In the oneness experience, there was peace. Right? And so I just concluded, and then it occurred to me, Ramesh, what if I can have this peace without a oneness experience? And it just all fell into play. Of course, this is what he's been saying every time I go there, every time I listen. Your happiness is simply the end of suffering in its negative form, right? Which is more accurate. So we don't even have an idea of happiness as something. Like Tom, exactly what Tom was saying. It's not something, it's just the ending of something. And what ends, we can say separation ends, but what separation? The intellectual or the psychological separation that is in place when we see ourselves through a belief as a separate doer, in control of everything that I think, feel, and do. A doer that is essentially, in experience separate, and then the belief comes in and creates a separation where we see the other as an enemy or a competitor, a rival, because in any moment the other can take away my happiness if I believe it's in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And that's the separation that falls away. That's the separation that created our uncomfortableness. And when that falls away, the experience is known to be an experience, non-dual in nature, but the content of the experience continues, even with the realization, continues to be content of duality, content where the experience is, if I drop all concepts, the experience is that there is Roger here.
Just thank you very much. I'm going to make my leave. Enjoyed it. My brain's just, full up.
Very good, thank you. And where was I?
Filling up brains.
Filling up brains. So
the content is the consciousness.
Roger wasn't here.
Did I say? No, I said Roger is here in practice. And so it's actually still... See, this is where we have these ideas, we listen to other teachings that say Roger isn't here, and even when the words are actually in experience, Roger is very much here, we hear, oh, he's saying Roger isn't here. This is life. Life forces us to experience and creates the experience exactly as it is. And I listened to Ramesh's teachings where he's saying Ramesh is the ego. The ego doesn't go anywhere. What goes is the sense of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So there is an ego before enlightenment with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, and there is an ego after enlightenment, but now without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And so in practice, the separation is only on an attitudinal level. On an experiential level, there is still the sense of me being a separate entity to you, and me being separate to the chair and to the trees. And in any moment, if we drop into being, yes, that separation on a subtle experiential level can be seen to not really be there. But so the point being here is we can be intimate with life, and that can happen simply because we're no longer resisting life. There's an attitudinal acceptance for what is, and it doesn't require the end of separation on an experiential level, more on an attitudinal level.